everyone. Welcome back to the Brighter Black Futures podcast. I'm your host, Bisa, and today I've got a great episode on tap for you. Today we're talking about racism, specifically how it intersects with other oppressive systems and is actually a tool of oppression that has nothing to do with its victims. It's more about its use as a tool of oppression. That's what we're going to talk about today, and why I think this is important to discuss, because the more I understand that as I grow and learn, the more I can separate acts of racism from me and my person, make it not about me. And I think that is so important for all of us to teach to our children. And you're going to hear somebody else reiterate that point later, but let's get into it. And now it's time for the upliftments segment of the podcast. If you've been here before, you know this is a section where I share a quote that inspires me and ties into a theme and that I think you all should know about. And I'm going to have to read it because it's a long one from one of my favorite people, Ms. Toni Morrison, the late, great Ms. Toni Morrison. So here it is. The function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, and so you spend 20 years proving that you do. None of that is necessary. There will always be one more thing. And that is so true about racism. I think if you are someone who has been impacted by it and knows how heavy the weight of it can be, depending on your place or space and your social location in the society you live in, it can be really, really invalidating, keep you feeling off kilter all the time, have you living anxiety about it, immobilized sometimes, and sometimes in some cases when it's really extreme, it can be psychologically and physically unsafe for you as well. So racism is a huge distraction. It's definitely a social issue that impacts a lot of people who are racialized in all parts of the world, but it is indeed a distraction and a tool of oppression. And that quote is so good. I want to read it one more time because I love it so much. From Toni Morrison, here it is again. The function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, and so you spend 20 years proving that you do. None of that is necessary. There will always be one more thing, and ain't that the truth? All right, that wasn't such an uplifting quote, but it does tie in to what we're talking about today, and I think it is uplifting in a way because it's showing people who are impacted by racism that isn't about you at all. It's about keeping you off kilter, keeping you in a state where you're not going to be your best. And we are more resilient than that. That's why we're still here and we keep going. Now, on to the next segment. And now it's time for the Black History Moment. And today, what I'm going to share with you is some information about some Black activists who are doing big things and making history in the here and now that you should all know about. I'm going to talk about 3 people from different parts of the world who are doing big things to help Black people in their communities and beyond. And the first person I want to tell you all about is somebody you should definitely know about, and that is Ms. Kimberlé Crenshaw. Now, if you don't know that name, she is a civil rights activist, a really great critical race theory scholar, and also a professor of the laws. And she teaches at UCLA Law School and also at Columbia Law School. And Kimberlé is super important to the whole civil rights, anti-oppression movement, because she is the one who introduced and developed the idea of intersectionality or intersectional theory. That's the idea that your different social identities, particularly minority identities, intersect, of course, and then can influence how you experience oppression and systems of domination. For example, to make it really clear for folks who maybe have never heard of this before, when people are referencing the Blacks, they're often talking about Black men. When they're talking about women, they mean white women. So minority women of all stripes, particularly Black and Indigenous women, are left out of the conversation entirely, and you're not seeing their experiences. So intersectionality gave us language to talk about the ways certain groups can be invisible in discussions, particularly around oppression, and how we have to highlight that and make sure we find ways to discuss it. And I'm so glad for Kimberlé Crenshaw as a Black woman whose experience is often invisible in lots of discussions about racism and its impacts. And of course, as a woman, again, feminism often speaks of white women only, not Black women. And so we're at the intersection where we're not often discussed. And because of her, there's language for that. And that is a great thing. So thank you very much, Ms. Kimberlé Crenshaw. Now, the second person I want to tell you about is Canadian just like me. His name is Desmond Cole, and he's from Toronto, or he lives in Toronto currently. And he is an activist, broadcaster, author, and journalist. And he used to write a column for the Toronto Star up until 2017 when he resigned. More on that later. And he also has written pieces for BuzzFeed, The Walrus, Now Magazine, etc., etc. He is prolific, but he is best known for his book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power, which was a follow up to an essay that blew up in 2015 around the same issues, and where he discussed the fact that he'd been carded over 50 times. Carding is used to be a practice here in Toronto. Well, I think it still happens under a different name, but basically it's the police racially profiling mostly Black men or people who look different that they're suspicious of, and taking down their information and keeping it on record in case a crime is committed so they can find the culprits faster. Anywho, Desmond wasn't having it. He was carded over 50 times as a man who is an upstanding citizen in the city of Toronto, and he wrote about it. And the article was published in Toronto Life, and it was a national sensation. He blew up at that time. And then he wrote a follow-up book. So, of course, this man is an activist to the bone, and seriously so. And in 2017, he decided to go and demonstrate his activism and protest against the practice of carding, which doesn't sound cool from what I said, right? But he's advocating against it. And the Toronto Star said, nah, you violated our policies of activism as a journalist, so we don't like that. So he quit. He stood his ground and he quit. And he kept going in his own way, in his own time after leaving the Star. So mad respect for Mr. Desmond Cole. And if you don't know about him and you haven't read his book, let me say the title again. The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. You should totally check it out. It is a fabulous read, and I highly recommend. And the last person I want to talk to you about is a British national, and his name is Akala, aka Kingsley Daly. But if you want to find him, you want to Google Akala, Aklaa, online. And there's so many clips of this man speaking in interviews and talk shows and presenting, and he is amazing. A great and brilliant intellectual mind, just like all the other folks I mentioned so far. They're all super smart. Akala is a British rapper, poet, author, and activist, and I discovered him through clips on YouTube, and he has such a great way of making really complex issues and ideas, maybe issues that people who are not racialized have never heard before, and breaking it down in a way that's super concise and clear. And I would not want to debate Akala on any day because he's so knowledgeable. And his book, Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire, is an excellent book talking primarily about his life and then weaving it in with Pan-African ideals and the idea of ending oppression and so we can all live better all around the world, is fantastic and has so much history and goodness in it and really amazing insights. I can't recommend his book enough. And if you're not about reading a whole book, really look for him on YouTube, type his name in, and just see what he's saying. He is amazing and brilliant. And fun fact, because he's a rapper, he started as a rapper first, his sister is Ms. Dynamite, for those of you who know of that name. So there you go. All right. So Kimberlé Crenshaw, American, Desmond Cole, Canadian, and Akala, British national, are three people who are activists, who are doing big things and trying to change the trajectory around systems of oppression and how they impact racialized people, particularly Black people. And you should definitely, if you don't already know about them, check them out and learn more about them. Hello, everyone. I am back with my guest for today. Her name is Tracey Jatinder Mann. She is a registered social worker of Punjabi descent. Her family first came to Canada in the early 1900s, and she's also Sikh. I have to mention that. And part of her story is being involved with anti-racist work in the past, which is why I thought she'd be perfect for a discussion around race. And I'll let her tell you a bit more about herself and about that part of her journey. Tracey, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Bisa. I'm glad to be here.
All right, so I don't know as much about your anti-racist work, so I was wondering if you could just give us a little background about when you were doing that work, what you were involved in, and what that looked like for you.
Yeah, I think I can tell you a little bit about how I came into that work. So I think for me, as a young person, was pretty enthusiastic about environmental justice and grew up in a family where we talked about politics. And so and I didn't realize this, but I think anti-racism was always part of even our family conversations and understanding. So I think that allowed for me to be more open to seeing the world through these lenses. So I'm really appreciative to my family about holding those conversations, at the dinner table, or, watching a show and being able to talk about those dimensions as a kid growing up. So I think my entry point into anti-racism work really came after I started to notice that my original career goals or trajectory was to be in the environmental movement. And this was in the early 2000s. And more I found that as a South Asian person living out in BC, in Vancouver, that I was not seen as the type of person who was going to be in those roles, mainly because I was racialized. And so the type of work that I could find in my field of study was to be a multicultural liaison to environmental work, but never being able to be seen as someone who had knowledge about anything else around resource management or understandings of environmental issues. And environmental work historically was very campaign based, but I think in that time it was very exclusionary, and racialized people were not able to be seen as leaders in those campaigns. So it was through my trying to reimagine what career trajectory I would take that I became introduced through working at volunteering at a rape crisis center around the concepts of intersectional feminism and anti-oppression work. And that really just opened my eyes and gave me a language to name experiences in a more complex way. I already had a rudimentary understanding of racism, but that just opened my eyes. And through that kind of politicization process, I started to volunteer with a grassroots social justice group called No One Is Illegal. And that again furthered my understanding in my work. I'd already been doing kind of anti-globalization organizing and environmental work since I was 16. But it was through, being able to be in solidarity with a collective of other racialized individuals, a lot of BIPOC folks, that really deepened my understanding of and deepened my language and analysis around anti-racism. So it's through my work as a grassroots organizer that I started to understand more about Indigenous sovereignty, anti-Black racism, and really looking at how the colonial project of Canada is really about using race as a means of exacting power over.
Great point to end on, because that's something I really wanted to talk about. So the more I read, the more I learn, and I know you know way more than me, so let me contribute to that. But I'm learning a ton, and the more I realize that so racism is a big point of hurt for people who are racialized and impacted by it daily. And I think with anti-Black racism, a lot of Black people are. So you walk around in pain about this thing that's happening to you that you often can't control. And it feels like really deeply personal. And as I'm reading more and learning more, I'm recognizing just how much it isn't really about me, because it is a tool in the toolkit of people who have power to maintain power and keep us all divided from each other. And just based on what you just said at the end there, what are your thoughts on that idea?
Yeah, I can think of one of the earliest examples of really seeing racism in action in my life. So I was 9, and my father was in construction. So this is in the early 90s in Victoria, in BC again. And my father had built a home for a family who had been in Canada for 20 years. They're also Punjabi. And this was the first time of them being able to afford to own a home. And in order to make the home affordable, my dad had built a kind of flexibility for there to be 2 rental units within the home. But at the time, that was not common. And so, and you have to understand, Victoria is like a place of massive homes. Like there's like stately homes. But as my father was contacted by the local newspaper, the Times columnist, and was invited to do an interview, and he thought, "Wow, I'm, going to be recognized for my skills as a contractor." But instead, it was a Asian invasion, monster homes being built in Victoria. And this family, whose home was just close to completion, 3 days later is covered in blue spray paint with racial slurs and swastikas saying, Packies, go home. And my 9-year-old self was like, oh, they must be confused. We're not Peckies. In my naivety. And really realizing it was a signal to say, you don't belong here. And you don't deserve to own a home. And you don't deserve to have this kind of power. You can't have something this big because that is reserved for certain bodies, certain people. And again, it becomes a threat. Anybody like racialized folks having anything becomes a threat to a white supremacist power structure because it means that they have less of that power. So I started to understand from an early age that there was something going on. I didn't have language or words for it, but it really struck me from an early age that that I was going to be treated differently, and that proved to be true. As my life continued on. So not only has anti-racism work been a personal project, but it's striving for collective justice as well.
Right. I love that answer. So many things came up for me. And it is a shame that how many of us who are racialized learn that lesson from our early age that you're going to be treated differently. Like it's something that you learn so early on, whether your parents tell you about it or not, which is really tough. Something you said just now really struck me, the piece about if somebody who's racialized and not supposed to, air quotes, have power or privilege, that means that the dominant culture is losing power and won't have as much. And I've been reading a book called The Sum of Us, but I think it's Heather McGhee's her name, and it's talking about the cost of racism in America. And she mentions over and over again how the white working class has been taught that this is a zero-sum game. If the Blacks, if the natives, whoever rise up, they're losing. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Like just because X person who's racialized or X persons or community has more doesn't mean that the dominant culture has less. So I guess my question with that is, do you agree with what I'm saying? And why is it so many people believe that beyond? Because I think that might be an international thing, not just in the States where it's actually very purposely taught to the working class to keep them voting in a certain way.
Yeah. Well, I think let's take a step back. One thing that we don't often talk about is I really appreciate this quote by Toni Morrison that I want to share, which is at its core, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. And what I think also, not only to racialize folks is it a distraction, but when we look at it from a class perspective, racism is a distraction to poor white folks or to disadvantaged white folks because it keeps us distracted from the fact that we have billionaires. And so it lets throw racialized folks into the field as a distraction so that we don't actually talk about how a small number of people are hoarding resources in a pathological way. There is enough resources on this planet, even as in my background as an environmental geographer and having studied economics, there are more than enough resources to meet everyone's need. In fact, we destroy food because we don't want it sold at low costs because agribusiness wants those profits. There's so much. We have clothes that are being dumped in the deserts in Chile. We have more than enough resources to go around. But what we have is a problem of greed. So the very serious function of racism is to allow for income inequality to continue and to be justified. And so we use things like racism and oppression as a distraction from people who hold power. And instead of holding them accountable for the inequalities they are creating through their various serious use of and maintenance of their own power, that then people who have more in common with each other, poor white folks, poor Black and brown folks, do not become in solidarity with one another. That is the biggest threat, is that if we were to organize and mobilize together and see our struggles as one and the same, that we might actually decide that capitalism doesn't work for us anymore. And so to maintain racial capitalism, to maintain this power structure, we have to continue to use racism as a distraction, because then we might have more serious conversations about class, our economic system, and why we to continue to function in the ways that we do.
Okay, love that answer. And something else came up for me. I'm not sure how aware you are of social media. I don't know how much time you spend on it. But the US government is trying to get TikTok to give up some of its ownership so it can have US oversight. And that is the outgrowth of the pro-Palestinian stuff that happened online, where Starbucks ended up, I think, losing $1 million in a quarter, and they boycotted Kellogg's and a few other companies, and major impacts happened because people were galvanized together online. And the result is they're trying to create US oversight so they can control what happens on there. And I know that Meta, so that's Facebook and Instagram, they've announced that they're going to not push the content of political pages, even if they're paying for advertising, going to slow it down. And I think that's, again, another example of how those who are in power want the conversation to be a certain way and not go in directions that would lead to more solidarity with people internationally who are the masses, so to speak, the 99%.
Yeah. So again, like, it's very frightening. Net neutrality was a big topic of conversation in the early 2010s, really, and maybe earlier, but that's when I became aware of those conversations. But really looking at what does it mean when social media's power becomes amalgamated? Like if we look at it, Meta has a monopoly now at this point. There really is, Elon Musk really undermined Twitter. And so now really there's one space owned by one company that dominates content and media sharing. It's frightening. It's very, very frightening. So we have to look at how the shaping of our consciousness is controlled by a very few number of people, and that this move by the US government is a way to make sure that we only get certain kinds of information.
Yeah,
And
but
so, but it's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that wealthy people want to protect their wealth. Um, it's disgusting, and it's not aligned with my values. But in the logic of their logic, it makes sense that that's the moves that they are making, again, to prevent the broader public to be able to have autonomy and create their own lives, and to liberate themselves from the powers that be.
yes, and if I want to just add on to what you're saying, I think yes to maintain their wealth, but also like, to grow it, like because I don't think many of them are happy with maintenance. If they were,
Yeah. And I don't know how you can have everything. Like, I don't know how you can own everything, because
yeah,
then where do the rest of us go? It feels like a very much of a nihilistic end game that is being played, and that we're being moved towards this idea of many of us not existing. And I don't know what this end game is. I think they need to go back to kindergarten and learn, or play school and learn how to share their toys. I think there's some basic rudimentary human compassionate skills that these individuals are lacking, or some deep fear that their value only comes from the things that they own. And that's a very sad place to be.
I think that's a lot of people, unfortunately, not just
Yeah.
that money is what makes me in power, makes me human and valuable to a lot of people.
Yeah. That brings me to this concept of like power over versus power within, or power together, and power to. These are all concepts developed by an individual named Starhawk, who has written a lot about power. But really, in our society, I think at the core, we're fundamentally operating from a place of power over. And that's the only way that we know how to relate. But many of us are understanding that, hey, I have a innate power, like creators and artists have a power within. They've tapped into that energy. Um, Collective revolutions of, making gains often come with a power together, seeing that when we're together and when we operate with an intention of growing and moving forward and advancing collectively, there's so much power in being powered together. But our society is so focused on domination.
Isn't that courtesy of patriarchy? That's the whole definition, isn't it? The power,
Yeah.
whether
Well,
you're
I think. I think that one of the tools of colonization was patriarchy, and it was a primary tool used to divide communities. So if you divide men and women and use that gender binary to say there are men and women, if you divide communities in that way, then you can dominate them to say, hey, who's your enemy is your sister because you should have domination over her. Do you know who's your enemy is your mom because she should be doing what you say? Do you know who's your enemy is your wife? So that is a fundamental tool to use to coerce communities into even believing that someone is better than another person. And so it was a strategic tool used in colonization. You will see that communities that had less hierarchical gender dynamics were forced into, I think it was in a number of indigenous communities where when the colonizers were negotiating, they wouldn't let women be in the room, even if that was the tradition of that community.
A
So
lot.
colonization was used as a tool, patriarchy was used as a cool tool to advance colonization. And just like racism is another example of that. If we can find ways to divide a population, then we can conquer, divide and conquer. That's where that phrase comes from, is that you divide a community and not allow themselves to see that they are a cohesive unit, and then you can dominate them. So I think that's what has continued to happen. And if we don't allow those logics, if we resist those logics and decolonize and move away from those things, there is a type of power together that is very threatening. And I think that's why this right to assemble, a right to be together, rights to organize, rights of certain groups are being dismantled so that we don't see ourselves as a force that is able to collaborate and see a life of togetherness.
100%. I agree with that 100%. And it's just amazing to me that 500 years plus they've been using that to maintain the current power systems and keep certain people in a very powerful position while the rest of us struggle and or have relatively very little.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So switching gears, because I have so many more questions to ask. You mentioned when you were working in environmental protection of the work, you weren't getting any advances in that space that were meaningful as far as policy. You were the multicultural liaison, only at best. And I think a lot of people are experiencing that in corporate spaces who are racialized. And I think Black people, Indigenous people for sure, but others as well. So what would you say to somebody who's fighting that fight and wants to stay in the space they're in and hopefully move through it? Any advice that you could offer?
I think at the core is like to be really tender with yourself and the people around you and to find that solidarity, find community. Oftentimes, again, that piece of dividing is to make us feel like we're alone, like we're the only one experiencing this. As a therapist, I work with predominantly BIPOC communities. And one of the things that I try to remind the folks that I work with is that this is a part of a collective struggle. This is not because you've done something wrong. This is not because it's personal. And it is personal, it's personally felt. You become personally dispossessed of your ability to sustain yourself because of racism. Racism is a destructive force, but it is part of a broader logic that it's not because of anything about you that this is happening. It's about the oppressor. It's about the oppressor's fear. It's about the oppressor's greed. It's about the oppressor's scarcity mentality. It's all of those things that are contributing to that, not anything inherent within you. So find your people, find support, and to make sure that there are day-to-day practices that you have where you're not holding that in your body because that is not yours to hold.
I love that. It's so true and so real for me. I love that last bit. All right. And going from there, and speaking about not holding things in your body, I think when we experience oppressive forces when we're children, let's talk about racism around that. You take on the hurt in a different way than you would if you're an adult because you can't process as well. So, any advice that you may have? I know you mostly deal with adults in your practice, but I think some of the tools you have could maybe help children. Any advice you'd give to dealing as a child who's going through things at school or somewhere in their life that are tied to race and having a hard time moving through
Is
it?
really really creating moments for play and joy. And again, just allowing kids to feel that they deserve to be here, that they're loved, that their body is celebrated, and that for them to understand what's happening is part of something that's not about them, you know, and to create restorative, reconnecting opportunities because kids are here to show us the joy and beauty of what's possible when we get to be in the world, when we get to play, when we get to be creative, when we get to let our spirit shine and soar. And so creating more of those opportunities and talk to your kids about racism. There is never a day that where they are too young to learn about what's happening because the more they get that information, the more it's talked about, the more you express, hey, this isn't about you, the more that they can carry that in the spirit of their being and in their dignity. It allows them to rise up in their bodies, to be able to have that felt sense that this is not me. This is not what's happening, is not because of anything about me. It's because of someone else's fear. It's about someone else's need for power, but it's not about me. And if they can hold that in their bodies and get to move through the world in that way, I think that creates like a locus of possibility and transformation.
Which is beautiful because we want the babies to thrive. I love that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you think I should touch on that I haven't?
Yeah, I think, again, going back to that piece is racism as a distraction. Because instead of getting to build and getting to grow and getting to imagine futures and societies and worlds of possibility, we're always diverting our energy defending against. And I think as a collective project, we have to create spaces of incubation for the possibilities of different kinds of resource sharing models. Capitalism is a model of resource sharing. It's one that's saying, a small group of people get everything and the rest of you get to put out your plates and can I have some, sir? More porridge, sir. That's the reality that we've created. But we could create different models of resource sharing. And so instead of being distracted by and responding to the threat, sometimes we have to create a protective bubble so that we can create an incubator for other ways of being. And sometimes it's those small little actions of generosity, sharing, decolonizing, moving away from capitalism. Those are all the small little moves that we make that collectively add up into a transformation of something different.
This whole divide and conquer thing that is happening with people in power to prevent us from understanding we're a cohesive group around capitalism, or even smaller scale for BIPOC people to know that they can work together to even end the marginalization that they face with racism. There's a lot of inter-community conflict or racism happening. What are your thoughts about healing that or moving through that?
Yeah. So, we think we can gain power by having power over again. So lateral violence is saying, I am better than you. I'm more in proximity to whiteness. I'm more in proximity to these power structures that I see around us. And therefore, I'm going to show relationally that I have power by dominating and oppressing you. And it might be speaking ill of you. It might be denigrating you. But that doesn't really give you more power.
No, it doesn't. No, it
And
doesn't.
it really just leaves us all worse off. So I think it's about thinking, who am I allying with when I'm speaking in a certain way, when I'm engaging in a certain way, when I'm using a particular way of thinking? Am I creating more violence in the world by doing so? And if I am, then who am I aligning with? I'm aligning with a certain power structure because that's how I think I can access power. But there are many different ways of holding power. And, I think that's really imagining and getting comfortable with having different kinds of power is what allows us to resist what's happening.
I'm just thinking about the idea of many different ways of acquiring power, which I agree with. Do you have any books or resources about that subject? Because that's something I have not yet looked into.
Yeah, so there is Starhawk has written on different forms of power. I can't remember the title of the book, but that might be a space to check out. And then I think, there's so many intersectional Black feminist um, scholars who have very much informed and taught me so much of what I know that I think Kimberlé Crenshaw's work is really important. I think, it's seminal in many ways, but there is so much. There are so many books to name, but I think there's just such a great body of resource is that are available through Black feminist thought that I think have really opened up my mind, and especially abolitionist and decolonial perspectives. So there's too many to name.
You're with us. I really appreciate you.
I really appreciate you too. I'm so excited that you're doing this show, and thank you so much for taking the time to invite me on.
All right.
It's an honor.
Okay, thank you all so much for watching and listening. I hope that you enjoyed today's podcast and learned a thing or two, and that you'll be sure to check out the people I told you about, the Black History Moment folks, and that you enjoyed the interview with Tracey as much as I enjoyed having the discussion with her. All right, till next week, please take care of yourselves, be well, and know that I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Bye.